Mr. President, I ask, I'll speak to the leader later, I was going to ask about our colleague, Senator Paul, but I ask consent to be recognized in
the Senator from Illinois.
First, let me say at the outset, many of us have extended well wishes to our colleague, Senator Paul, who was injured over the weekend. I wish him a speedy recovery and hope that he returns soon to be part of the Senate. He's an important part of the Senate and an important colleague to those of us on both sides of the aisle. Mr. President, another gun massacre, horrible circumstances. I know you came to the floor earlier today to say a word about your feelings and the feelings of your family. They're shared by all of us. It is heartbreaking to think that some person so demented, so unusual would come into a worship setting and kill innocent people. This man, the reported shooter, Devin Kelly, used an assault rifle to kill 26 people in Sutherland Springs, Texas, wounding 20 others. The victims ranged in age from 18 months to 77 years. And about a dozen of those who were killed were children. They included the daughter of the church's pastor. The shooter reportedly drove up to the church wearing a bulletproof vest, tactical gear, and began firing in the parking lot before entering the church. At some point, a local resident who lived near the church began firing back, and the shooter then drove off with two residents in pursuit. Eventually crashing his car, he was found dead of a gunshot wound that may have been self-inflicted. Now, President Trump and others have said that this exchange of fire with citizens responding saved lives and shows that the policy response to the shooting should be to arm more good guys with guns. Let us not forget that 46 people were shot before these citizens came on the scene. Now, this reported shooter, 26 years old, had served in the U.S. Air Force from 2010 until 2014, working on logistics readiness. 2012, he was court-martialed for 2 counts of assault on his then-wife and child. He was sentenced to confinement for 12 months. He received a bad conduct discharge in 2014, remarried in 2014, and had worked as an unarmed security guard at a water park. He reportedly bought 4 guns, 1 each from 2014 to 2017. 3 of those weapons, the assault rifle, which he used in this crime, and 2 handguns were found at the scene. Local law enforcement said that the shooter was likely motivated by a domestic situation. His wife's grandmother was one of the victims. There's so many things that come to mind, and first and foremost is the grief that we all feel and sorrow for the families that were affected. It is so sad that when people go to church on Sunday, they are not safe from this gun violence and gun massacres that are occurring way too frequently across the United States. There are things that we need to do, and only we can do in Congress, to make the laws better and safer. I respect the Second Amendment. I respect the fact that there are men and women in my family, friends, people I represent across Illinois who own guns and use them safely and responsibly. We have sportsmen and hunters in my family. We have people who buy guns for sporting purposes, for self-defense. They store the guns carefully and safely. They take it very seriously that they are dealing with a deadly weapon. They don't want anyone innocent to be hurt. I respect that very much. I think we all should. But I also call on them now. They need to lead us into a more sensible policy when it comes to gun safety. The owners of firearms, overwhelmingly, when they're asked, believe that we should have comprehensive background checks to keep guns out of the hands of those who misuse them. Overwhelmingly, a majority of gun owners feel that way, as most Americans feel. Why can't we do that? We certainly know that it's within our power. In my state of Illinois, city of Chicago, we've reached 600 gun deaths this weekend for the year, 600. It is the highest number in over a decade. It's heartbreaking, and that doesn't include those who were injured by being shot as well. Where are these guns coming from? You cannot have a gun store in the city of Chicago, that's true, but When it comes to purchasing guns, it makes no difference. The suburbs have plenty of gun dealers. And of course, there are gun shows in neighboring states like Indiana. We also know that at these gun stores, which are in the suburbs of Chicago, they supply 25% of the identified crime guns. And we know many of those are sold in what's known as a straw purchase, sold to someone who could not legally qualify to buy a gun, but buys one for someone who is not legally qualified. A girlfriend or someone who buys a gun because she has no criminal record, so her boyfriend can use it, misuse it, kill innocent people. Can't we toughen that law and make it a law where there's real penalties for straw purchases? That's not going to slow down any legitimate gun owner or anyone who wants to use a gun in a responsible fashion. That's one thing we can do. And the gun show loophole. We know that at Columbine and other places, it was a gun show loophole that opened the way for the purchase of guns which killed innocent people. Let's do something about that. We should. If we're serious, we should. We also know that we have prohibitions in the 1996 Lautenberg Amendment prohibiting convicted domestic abusers from buying or possessing guns. That applies as well to military personnel. Questions need to be asked and answered about this shooter in Texas and what happened after he was court-martialed for domestic abuse in the Air Force in 2012. How did he purchase a gun after that in violation of the Lautenberg Amendment? We need to also ask why in the world anyone needs to own an assault weapon. I understand people who buy rifles, shotguns, and even handguns for sporting and self-defense, but why does anyone need to own a military-style weapon, one that can be converted, as we found in Las Vegas, to a weapon that discharges 100 rounds in 7 seconds? That is totally unnecessary for any legitimate legal purpose. It is available perhaps for military use, perhaps for law enforcement, but not for the ordinary American citizen who would purchase and own a gun for legitimate purposes. Next, we need to make sure that we understand why this gun violence is growing in America. The number of people who have been killed, injured, just grows by the year. It's getting worse. We need to also talk about the issue of mental health raised by the president in response to this tragedy in Texas. The president said, quote, "This isn't a gun situation. I think that mental health is your problem here," end of quote. Despite the fact that most violence in the United States has nothing to do with mental illness, many are arguing that mental health is really the issue. What have we done in the United States Senate when it comes to mental health and guns this year? We used the CRA to repeal a regulation that directed the Social Security Administration to share mental illness information with the background check compilation of information. There was an advocacy for massive cuts to Medicaid, which would throw millions of people with mental health needs off coverage. There was an attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act that would have allowed insurers to refuse coverage of essential health benefits, including mental health treatment. And there was a refusal to provide additional federal funding to help provide mental health care. We don't have a very good record this year in the Senate when it comes to taking mental illness seriously, and we should. We also need to make sure that we introduce a bill, which I'm working on, to encourage more crime gun tracing in light of last week's Crime Gun Trace report from the Chicago Police Department. Mr. President, we focus on terrorism and what it does to our country, and we should. That's our responsibility. Anyone, as in 9/11, who would do harm to innocent Americans, killing 3,000 in that particular instance, needs to be taken extremely seriously by all of us in Congress and in the White House. Foreign sources of terrorism need to be carefully watched when it comes to our border security, when it comes to background checks and the like. But let's be honest, more Americans are dying from Americans killing Americans with guns than by terrorist activity. It is just as much a death as any foreign terrorist threat would be. And we need to consider it just as seriously as we do when it comes to the issues of terrorism and safety for the people of America. Why doesn't the United States Congress take this up? Why don't we even have a debate? I'm on the Senate Judiciary Committee. We've not had a single bill this year that addresses gun safety. Not one, despite the gun violence that takes place every day, and despite tragedies like this tragedy over the weekend at Sutherland Springs, Texas. Mr. President, I ask that the full statement of my remarks be placed in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, in a separate place in the record, I would like to make note of the fact that on September 5th, almost 2 months ago, Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced the Trump administration's repeal of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, better known as DACA. DACA provided temporary legal status to immigrant students if they registered with the government, paid a fee, passed a criminal and national security background check. It was renewable on a 2-year basis. The young people protected by DACA are also known as Dreamers. They came to the United States as children. They grew up knowing only this country, believing this was their home and their future. Many of them in their teenage years were told quietly by a parent that their legal status was not the status of an American citizen. These kids who grew up singing the Star-Spangled Banner and pledging allegiance to the American flag have no country. It was 7 years ago that I sent a letter to President Obama, joined by Senator Dick Lugar, a Republican from Indiana. On a bipartisan basis, we asked President Obama to establish a program like the DACA program. The President responded, DACA has been a success. Almost 800,000 Dreamers have come forward. They've surrendered to their government the information which many of their families kept secret for years. They trusted us. They gave this information to the government and said, we want to become part of America's future and we are willing to sign up, submit ourselves to the background check, pay our taxes, pay the filing fee, do whatever is necessary. They trusted us. These people, these young people who came forward and received DACA, have then gone on to contribute fully to their country. They're teachers, they're nurses, engineers, first responders, service members in our military. Now, because of President Trump's announcement, the deportation clock is ticking on these young people. Beginning on March 5th, 2018, not that long from now, every workday for the following 2 years, approximately 1,400 Dreamers will lose their work permits and be subject to deportation. These young people who trusted our government, now with the decision to end DACA, will find themselves in an extremely vulnerable position. And when they lose their DACA protection, if they're teachers, they're forced to leave their students. If they're nurses, they're forced to leave their patients. If they're first responders, they leave their post. And if they're soldiers willing to die for our country, they're forced to leave our military service. This isn't just a looming humanitarian crisis, it's also an economic crisis. The Nonpartisan Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy reports that DACA-eligible individuals contribute an estimated $2 billion a year in state and local taxes. The Cato Institute, a conservative operation, estimates that ending DACA and deporting DACA recipients will cost $60 billion and result in a $280 billion reduction in economic growth over the next 10 years. Poll after poll shows overwhelming bipartisan support for these Dreamers. Even Fox News, no liberal media outlet, recently found that 79% of Americans support a path to citizenship for Dreamers, including 63% of those who voted for President Trump. 63, almost 2 out of 3 Trump supporters support a legal status for Dreamers. The answer is clear. Congress needs to pass the DREAM Act, and we need to do it before we leave Washington, D.C. for the holidays. It was 16 years ago that I introduced this bipartisan legislation to give this path of citizenship to these young people. In July, I introduced the most recent version with my friend Lindsey Graham, Republican senator from South Carolina. Over the years, I've come to the floor over 100 times to tell the individual stories of the Dreamers. These stories tell us what's at stake when we consider the fate of DACA and the DREAM Act. Today, I want to tell you about Ha Yoon Lee. When she was 6 years old, her family came to the United States from Korea. She grew up in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. Here is what Ha Yoon says about her childhood in the United States, and I quote, "I was fortunate enough to grow up learning that diversity is encouraged and differences are not just tolerated, but welcomed. Ha Yoon was a good student, and committed to public service. High school, she was a member of the National Honor Society, received the Principal's Academic Achievement Award, and was an Oakland Activities Association Scholar Athlete. Member of the track and field team all 4 years of high school. Ha-Yoon is now a senior at the University of Michigan, majoring in English. She volunteers with the Red Cross, and she's co-president of an organization called The Supply, which raises money to help students in Nairobi, Kenya, attain an education. As co-president, Ha-Yoon has expanded this organization's efforts, and now they're volunteering locally near Detroit. Ha-Yoon was also a policy and programs intern for the Asian Americans Advancing Justice Center. As Ha-Yoon completes her last year of college, her dream is to become a lawyer to defend civil rights. She wrote me a letter, and here's what she said. Although I'm legally labeled as an alien in this country I call home, I believe I'm an American. And I believe this not solely because I live, study, work, and contribute in this country, but because I believe in the core values all Americans share as a nation: liberty, justice, and prosperity. Ha-Yoon and other dreamers have so much to contribute to our country. But without DACA or the DREAM Act, they will be deported back to countries where they haven't lived since they were children. Will America be stronger if we deport people like Ha-Yoon? I think the answer is obvious. When we introduced the DREAM Act, Senator Graham said, and I quote, "The moment of reckoning is coming." That moment, Mr. President, has arrived. Congress has the responsibility to do our job and make the DREAM Act the law of the land before the end of the year, before we go home for the holidays. Otherwise, we will bear the responsibility for forcing hundreds of thousands of talented young immigrants out of the workforce and putting them at risk of immediate deportation. Mr. President, many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle are interested in finding a path to get this done. I salute all of them who in good faith have offered their help. We have to focus now. We have to come together and focus. Many of my Republican colleagues have said we need to put in border security elements. Count me in. Let's sit down and have an honest discussion about making our borders safer and stronger. I will gladly join in that conversation. And I think there are many things that we can agree on that will lessen the likelihood that there will be those coming across the border in the years to come. I recently met with the head of border security, and we talked about things that might be done. There's something called a Z portal. I didn't know about it, but it's a virtual X-ray machine, low-level radiation X-ray machine, that can X-ray vehicles and determine whether or not they are secreting individuals or contraband that shouldn't be allowed in this country. He talked about one particular crossing, border crossing, and said we have a Z portal there, but it only can be used on about 1 out of every 5 vehicles. He said, I'd like to have more of them, and I think he should. Why wouldn't we make that part of border security? And I said, what about other things coming in this country other than people and contraband? Well, he says, one thing we're concerned about is fentanyl. Fentanyl is a chemical that is used to enhance the addiction of heroin. And sadly, it is deadly. Many heroin addicts die when they lace the heroin with fentanyl and inject it. And so we try at the borders to stop the importation of this fentanyl from China and other countries into the United States. I asked him about it, and he said, sadly, we don't have enough new spectrometers which are used to test these chemicals. We need them, he said, to stop the flow of this deadly drug into our country and to protect the men and women who are doing the actual surveillance. Now, isn't that something we can agree on a bipartisan basis to make our borders safer, to lessen the likelihood of people dying from the opioid heroin crisis? These are things we can do together. Somehow, we haven't been able to come up with a list of particulars from the other side of what they'd like to move forward on. But I am ready and willing and determined to get this done. We have to do this year. There is no excuse. There are too many lives at stake, not just the 780,000 DACA individuals, but all of the people that they are helping in their lives today. They're depending on us. We're running out of time. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me in this constructive and bipartisan effort. And Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.